If you love our podcast, then I suspect you will be super pleased to join us live. That's right, it's time for our annual No Small Endeavor Live Thanksgiving show. This year we'll be joined by New York Times bestselling author David Brooks with special guests Amy Grant and Sheryl Crow. It's a night of thoughtful conversation, moving music, and a room full of folks all in pursuit of no small endeavor. This year it's at the beautiful Schermerhorn Symphony Center here in Nashville, Tennessee. Mark your calendars for November 24. You will not want to miss this amazing night with some of our all-time favorite guests on the show. Don't wait. Go get your tickets now at nosmallendeavor.com. No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. This is No Small Endeavor. You're listening to our unabridged interview with poet Christian Wiman. Chris was once the editor of Poetry Magazine, the country's oldest poetry journal. These days he's on the faculty at Yale Divinity School. I first got to know Chris probably a decade ago. We did a show together out in Abilene, Texas. He was one of our guests on that show there at the beautiful old Paramount Theater in Abilene, Texas. My lovely wife, Laura, and I had lived in Abilene for 3 years when I was in seminary and she was doing her MBA. And so it was really a special treat to go back out and do that show there in Abilene. And it was a delight to have Chris Wiman. I had been reading his work and was moved by that beautiful evening, of which I still have very fond memories. Today we're discussing his recent memoir entitled Zero at the Bone, 50 Entries Against Despair. Chris was diagnosed probably 20 years ago with a rare form of lymphoma. His doctors told him that he had about 5 years to live. So he's been through the great travails of treatment and a great deal of suffering. And it's, of course, allowed him to process and grapple with many of the great existential questions of being. And this comes out in very powerful and profound, poignant ways in his poetry and in his prose. It's a lovely interview. I was grateful to get to sit down with him here in Nashville. I had a great time in the interview and a lovely time having dinner together afterwards. Enjoy, Chris Wiman. Poet Christian Wiman is the author, editor, or translator of 14 books from 2003 until 2013. He was the editor of Poetry Magazine, the premier magazine for poetry in the English-speaking world. He's written for The New Yorker, Harper's, the New York Times Book Review, The Atlantic Monthly, and numerous other publications. He's a former Guggenheim Fellow, holds 2 honorary doctorates. His particular interests include modern poetry, the language of faith, and accidental theology, that is, theology conducted by unexpected means. He's currently on the faculty at Yale Divinity School, and today we're discussing his recent memoir, Zero at the Bone, 50 Entries Against Despair. Welcome, Chris.
Good to see you again, Lee.
It's good to see you again. Really grateful to get to be with you today, to have you here in Nashville, in person.
Exactly. Yeah, it worked out great.
And you come down to Tennessee every now and then, right?
I do. My wife has a house that has been passed down in her family, which is about an hour from here near Bell Buckle.
Yes.
It was built in 1790, so we're here for a while in the summer every year.
Yeah. Well, good to have you here with us today. I think I found myself perhaps a bit intimidated in trying to think about how to get at some sort of summary. Perhaps it's because you're a poet, and perhaps it's because your prose is like poetry. And so I don't want to be too prosaic in my in my sort of sum of your book. But I found as I was trying to do so that I came back to a poem that you have in the book. And I was wondering, it may be you actually first pointed me to this poem by George Herbert, or my former student and friend Britt Norval did, who has also read you a lot. So I don't know how I got to the George Herbert poem, but it's actually one of my favorites. And I had quoted it enough that a colleague of mine had her daughter paint one of the phrases from the poem that's hanging on my office wall. My question, I'll recite the poem here, but my question that I'll start with is, in some ways, is it almost like your book is a commentary on this particular poem? So let me recite it for the readers, for the listeners. Ah, my dear angry Lord, since thou dost love, yet strike, cast down, yet help afford, sure, I will do the like. I will complain, yet praise, I will bewail, approve, and all my sour, sweet days I will lament and love.
Yeah, it could be. That's a good poem to think of as encapsulating that book. I mean, I do think of those things as completely entangled in my life. Love and anger, absence and presence. I never seem to experience one wholly. It's always raveled together in some way.
Yeah. Related, you had this line from Kierkegaard, what is a poet? And he answers, an unhappy person who conceals profound anguish in his heart, but whose lips are so formed that as signs and cries pass over them, they should be like beautiful music. How do you, I guess begin to unpack some of that for us. How do you see all that holding together somehow, or maybe not holding together?
Well, for me, poetry has always been the way that it's held together. I mean, poetry is a way of holding ambiguities without having to choose between them. And I think there's a reason that so much of the Bible is in poetry, over a third of it. And we read the Bible incorrectly if we don't realize this, that we're often, I mean, if you think of it, so much of life we experience in entangled ways, in ambiguous ways. Even our moments of joy may be shadowed with some sort of sorrow. They often are, even if it's only the fact that the joy ends or the joy shows us a life that we're not living the rest of the time. And so much anguish often is accompanied by fugitive gleams of joy. You can experience joy in the worst circumstances, not happiness, but you can experience joy. And I mean, I've experienced that in my life when I've been sick so much of the last 20 years, and yet some of my most graced moments have occurred during those times, and wonderful experiences of joy. W.H. Auden says kind of flippantly that poetry is the clear expression of mixed feelings. And that's probably a little too glib, but it does get at the heart of something, that poetry is necessary to our life because it lets us inhabit the space of life without defining it in a way.
You had one line where you said, suffering can suddenly catalyze an intimacy that ordinary life would have prohibited. And it seems that sort of thread of intimacy runs throughout your discussion. And at the same time, you seem quite aware that while suffering can, on the one hand, in one section of the book, you talk about how suffering can, on the one hand, catalyze a sort of compassion for another, but at the same time, it can turn oneself inward on oneself.
Yeah, it really depends on how you are dealing with the suffering. I mean, I had the experience of about 16 months ago now, I underwent a form of bone marrow transplant where you have your T cells taken out, they're genetically re-engineered and put back in your body. And I was really out. I was done. And I got into this clinical trial. By done, I mean dead. And I got in this clinical trial, and I was the first person in the country with my disease to have this treatment. And during that, I had to be in Boston for 6 weeks. And my wife couldn't come for most of that because we have kids who are in school, and we couldn't disrupt their lives. And we wanted to keep their lives as continuous as possible. And so two of my old friends came, and one is a sort of Buddhist Jew that I have known for over 30 years, and the other is a She's a poet. Another is a novelist who is not religious in any way, but does have a feeling for the mystery of existence and is respectful of religion. And I had the sense they were with me the whole time, and at different times, each of them, and it was wonderful. The experience with both of them, because we were able to be close in ways that we probably never have before, and it had to do with the sense that I was dying. So everything was stripped away, and we sort of didn't hide anything at all of ourselves from each other. And I felt like Christ was in those relationships at the time, even though I'm not projecting Christ onto them or saying that they're anonymous Christians or something like that. I think Christ is present in circumstances far beyond religion, far beyond Christianity. And I really haven't had an experience like that in my life. So that's an instance where suffering, I think, catalyzes an intimacy that couldn't happen otherwise.
Have you found ways to, let me back up and ask this. So when I would speculate one way to come at what I just heard you say would be that when you're facing death, there's not much left to lose, and that opens up possibilities for intimacy, letting go of our masks or letting go of our pretense or whatever it might be. And if you do think that that's at least part of what's going on there, have you found ways to continue to have that when you're not on death's doorstep?
No, I think it really does require that urgency. I think we fall back into the lives that we have to live, in which we are mostly masks. And even with those that we're intimate with, humankind cannot bear very much reality, as Eliot says, and you really couldn't live at that degree of nakedness. You would just be incinerated, and it couldn't be sustained. And so I do think that there are moments in life when everything does get stripped away, and you hope that you can rise to the occasion. But it's not something that you can sustain. It's not something that you can will.
Ambivalence seems to be another kind of thread through a lot of your thought. And I've got a few quotes I'll point to in a moment, but this sort of insistence on looking at it this way and yet looking at it this way. Which I'm very drawn to, but I would imagine it's off-putting to some folks. But where do you think that kind of tendency to embrace that ambivalence comes from for you?
Well, I think it's just in my mind. It's the way I experience the world. I just did a book with the theologian Miroslav Volf, whom I know you know, and Miroslav and I are very good friends. And we decided, we were having an email exchange at one point, and we decided to, we were getting involved. We said, why don't we just make this formal and see what happens if we send an email to each other every week about what we're thinking about faith and see where it goes. So we just finished it. And I think it was quite frustrating to Miroslav to have me, to have my ambiguities coming back at him every time he made a theological argument. But it was useful to both of us because, that ambiguity, there are healthful aspects of it, but it can also become a muddle and keep you from ever simply claiming what you believe. And so I think it was useful to me to have a kind of clear orthodox position articulated against my muddle. I do think I'm mostly a muddle.
On that, you say at one point, here's an obvious truth. I am somewhat ambivalent about religion. Here's another. I believe that the question of faith, which is ultimately inseparable from the which is ultimately separable from the question of religion, is the single most important question that any person asks in and of her life. Unpack those two for us.
Well, this is my lifelong wrestling with the forms of faith. I do feel like the faith is the most important thing in my life, but I've never found a form that is satisfying to me, or in which, to put it more bluntly, more sharply, a form in which I don't feel that my own experience is being violated. And so that's a constant wrestle for me, because I'm desperate for some community in which to believe. And at various times in my life, I've had that, and I do believe in it very much. And I respect the institution of the church. I respect my students who are going into these jobs. Many of my students are becoming ministers, and there's something heroic in that at this particular cultural moment. But for myself, I have always felt outside of the institution, and I don't consider myself a Catholic or a Protestant. I do consider myself a Christian, but I'm pretty frustrated with the ways that we try to tame God and try to contain God in ways that make the experience palatable, gentle, socially sort of lubricating. And I think actually the experience of God is often quite difficult to integrate into a community, difficult to integrate into a relationship. And so that's always been a real pull for me, those two things.
You said you've had a hard time finding a form that doesn't feel violating of you, I think was your... Unpack that a bit. Say more about that.
Well, I mean, it varies depending on the form. I mean, I've been to so many different churches, and always something happens that that I just disagree with so profoundly. Or often just there's a mismatch between the urgency with which I feel in my own interior communion with and wrestling with God, and the banality of the spaces in which this is supposedly being expressed. And so I'm often bored out of my skull at church, And if I'm not bored, I just disagree so profoundly with what's being said. And I also feel that most churches don't allow for a space for a wild God, for how wild God could be, I mean, Annie Dillard has that famous paragraph about saying that people should be wearing crash helmets in church and, lashing themselves to the pews. I think this is a typical problem with an artist, because if you feel, most of my sense of faith comes from my experience of art. And if that's where it comes from, I mean, that is an intense engagement with God and with reality. And then to step into somewhere where you're just sort of having coffee hour, it's a jolt.
Hmm. In that same section, you say, as for my children, I would like them to be free of whatever particular kink there is in me that turns every spiritual impulse into anguish.
I wish I hadn't said every. It's not every. Most spiritual impulses. But yeah, I would like my kids to have I don't think that I'm a model for a healthy life with God. I would like them to have I think it's quite possible. The people who have had the most exemplary faith that I've noticed in my life have not been like me. They've been much more at ease with the world and with the forms of religion that they practice, And I think that is the model. That's the goal.
When you think of that kind of potential exemplary model, any particular people come to mind for you?
Well, the first person that comes to mind is my grandmother. She had a kind of being in the world that I thought, I didn't recognize this, of course, when I was young, but I lived with her in my early 20s for a while, and that's when I came to see it. She was just utterly in her world and knew every plant and every change of weather and every detail of the people around her, and knew and trusted her relationship with God. And that was all woven together for her. It was seamless. And she was not conscious in a way that we think of consciousness, which is a kind of apprehensive or apprehending something. You know, taking hold of something is the way that in the West we think of consciousness. But I think there are other ways of being conscious which are more passive and not completely passive, but more passive, and she had that in a way. There are other people, you know. I was just reading an interview with Marilyn Robinson on the plane this morning, and I'm always amazed at her. I'm always amazed at the way her life seems. Now, she's a good example of somebody who is conscious in the way we think of as taking hold of something, and yet she also seems completely settled in her mind, and I think that's why she speaks with so much authority. She has so much authority when she speaks, because her aesthetic life and her moral life are not separate at all. They're completely, and her spiritual life, they're all one thing. And she speaks coherently out of that. And I'm sort of in awe of that.
When you think about rhythms of life as an artist, as a poet, what rhythms, habits, practices do you have that that have meant a lot to you, that you're grateful for, that have been fruitful for you, and what are some that you are missing, or even that are kind of counter habits, vices, with regard to your sense of calling?
I've never had good habits. I write all the time. I mean, it's hard for me not to write. And that said, I'll go a year, or it's been longer. I've gone 3 years without writing a poem, not by choice, but I've just been unable to. And then I'll suddenly write, as in the past few months, I've written the bulk of a book of poems. So I've never had any habits like sit down and write for this many, except when I was young. I would read for 5 hours a day. When I was young, I would do that. But I've never had anything like, you know, people write a poem a day, or they write, you know, these writing routines and stuff. I've never actually understood that. I could never do that. So I don't have any habits. Seamus Heaney says, cultivate a work lust that imagines its haven in your hands, like something, I can't remember, but I do think a writer cultivates a work lust where it becomes, you have to do it. And I have to do it in order for my mind not to devour itself. It's I somehow have to be having thoughts and giving them form, or my mind begins to devour itself.
Do you think of writing as analogous to meditation in any way?
Not at all. It's chaotic, and it's the opposite of meditation. It's no. I'm restless and moving around, and if I'm really writing, but I can sit with a poem, if it's got me, I can sit with a poem for hours very still. Richard Wilbur used to say that if someone observed him, it would just be like it was watching someone look out the window for 4 hours. And I understand that. That's sort of the way I am too. If a poem's got me, I can really, really concentrate. But for the most part, like writing prose, I'm all over the place. I'm up and down and shouting and cursing. It's not meditative, not peaceful.
Do you write? You type, or do you write by hand, or how do you do it?
Both.
Yeah.
I always did everything by hand when I was young, but I've gradually moved to the computer. I do all the prose on the computer now, but poems usually start by hand.
Yeah. Grief. You say at one point, time can get stuck in the mind and life of someone who has not learned to properly grieve. So describe for us what you think improper grief looks like.
Well, it can take many different forms. I guess it is a kind of, it can take different forms. I guess it can be a kind of obsessiveness, or it can be a denial. Either one of those. I'm trying to remember what I was saying around that quote, what I was talking about. I don't really remember.
It may have been in essay 42, I Sang Pain, or in that area of the book, I think. But let me ask this. I wondered too if the book is one exhibition of what you take as proper grieving, or at least your one effort at proper grieving.
Yeah, some of that, I guess, I hope is, there are essays in there about my father and about my sister. And I guess finding form for some of that, I hope, is proper grief. I was really worried about the one with my sister. I wrote the essay, the first part of it, and then let it sit for 12 years in a drawer. It was coming out in a magazine, but I pulled it, and something was wrong, and I didn't feel comfortable with it, and so I pulled it, and I really thought the essay was good, and so it hurt me to pull it. But I didn't know what to do with it, so I put it away for 12 years, and then I realized what was wrong with it, as I say in the book, that I had not given someone enough autonomy and soul, my sister, in the essay. And so I wrote the second half looking at what I had done, which I think made a honorable essay out of it. So that's an example of improper grief in the first instance, was probably trying to formulate the experience before it was ready to be formulated, and not letting the complexity of the experience in there. And then I hope the proper grief was allowing the grace of the second part into that experience. One of the real lessons of my life as I've gotten older is the way that, and I talk about this in the book, is the way that we think of hope as always projecting forward into the future, but it goes backwards as well. That hope can change the way that you see the past in some way, and can reconfigure the past and loosen the past so that it becomes fluent and able to speak in different ways, and that's really what that essay was about.
Mm-hmm. I think your language there was you were sharing about an experience of visiting your sister in prison, I think it was. And as you described, as you moved to the second part of the essay, you even used the language of, you felt as if there was a sin in the essay, in not allowing the possibility of some sort of change or some sort of, I don't know that you used the word of redemptive possibility, but it seemed like that was in effect, I think what I heard you saying is that perhaps sometimes it's harder for us to assume the possibility of hope in our families than it might be looking at the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's probably true. And I think one danger of being a writer is that you become very adept at formulating people and situations. And I mean, that very facility can distort the reality of the situation, so that you make a beautiful thing, which perhaps comes at the cost of the complexity or the reality that the thing came out of. And you have to really guard against that, I think, particularly if you're writing about other people.
One a little passing comment you made that you said that yesterday, coming out of the parents' meeting at the therapist's office, I said there was something about the nature of that therapeutic language that was inimical to my imagination. And Dee, your wife, said, "You mean inimical to your repressions?"
Yeah, she's good to have around. She punctures here.
But yeah, how have you found the language of therapy? I mean, given so many of the sort of heavy traumas that you've experienced, how have you found that language helpful, and how have you found it inimical?
Well, I mean, that therapeutic language is obviously helpful. It's taught us all to reconceive of our past and to think of integrated personalities, and to think of the way we have a self in the world, and to develop that self and nurture that self. On the other hand, it's also taught us to think of ourself above other things often, and to put emphasis on the self as opposed to the community is the way I often experience it. And in the milieu that I'm in, I particularly see it as among children, their feelings get valued over responsibilities to the community. And the development of a child's psychological self becomes this fundamental good or fundamental goal. And I think that's a terrible mistake. I think that the community in which the person is raised is more important than the child's feelings. And often what we think may be bad for the kid, shame, for instance, might actually be good. And it might be a good thing to feel some shame in your life if you've done something wrong, and to try to repair that in the community. And I think that it's just part of the psychological culture that I certainly find myself in. We think too much of the self. And I think it's the great poison of poetry, actually, in the last 60, 70 years. And I think the poets that will last will be those who retained an old notion of being. That was their goal, and not some self, not some interrogation and excavation of the self and refinement of the self. And a lot of poetry has been devoted to that, and it's tedious.
Joy and happiness. You mentioned joy and happiness a moment ago. and presumed a distinction between them. How I've tended lately to not carry as much as a distinction between the two.
We're in a period of rapid change, and sometimes it can feel like things are spinning out of control. With political tensions, anxiety, and loneliness rising, and questions about how to live a good life on everyone's mind, finding answers can seem harder than ever. For millennia, spiritual thinkers have offered wisdom and tools to help people find their way in trying times. Advice that even a scientist like me, Dave DeSteno, is finding have a lot to offer. To join the conversation, look for How God Works wherever you listen to podcasts.
And I'm not sure if that's a good move or not. And the reason, I think, is that there's this sort of, common distinction that joy is some sort of something not so much related to circumstances, whereas happiness is more related to circumstances. Or at least that's the way I hear a lot of people define the difference between the two. But I still tend to think that, I guess what I've done a lot of times with my students is I keep leaving a definition of happiness vague. And you don't have to go too far in thinking about happiness and joy to know that any sort of definition of happiness or joy that's grounded simply in dopamine release or pleasure in that regard isn't going to suffice very well. But I kind of like leaving it ambiguous as this sort of thing that we generally kind of know what it is, but let's just see where it goes. But I don't know. How do you think more about that distinction, or is that distinction important to you? Or
it is very important. I think of them as very different. There are different ways to go at it. I think of happiness as being a horizontal feeling, and of joy as being a vertical one. And I do think of happiness as occurring in time, as being associated with time, and a moment of joy cuts into our lives and seems outside of time in some way. C.S. Lewis attributed his conversion to Christianity to 3 experiences of joy that he had when he was young. And he said they left him homesick for a home he didn't know he had. And implicit in that is that what I said earlier, that joy may come with some sort of sorrow attached to it. Richard Wilbur has a poem where he looks at a stream, describes it through 7 stanzas beautifully, and then he says, joy's trick is to supply dry lips with what can cool and slake, leaving them dumbstruck also with an ache nothing can satisfy. And I don't think you'd say that about happiness, that it has quite such a powerful and conflicting hit on us. I did a whole anthology of poems about joy, and the reason I was provoked into doing that was I read an essay by Zadie Smith in the New York Review of Books, which was simply called Joy, and she was distinguishing between joy and pleasure, and she said that she'd had, if she counted up the experiences of joy in her life, she'd had maybe, I think she said 6. And most of them were experiences of love, intense love, or the birth of a child. And then she distinguished it of all these other kinds of pleasure that she had and moments of happiness. And she said at the end that if an angel came down and offered her another moment of joy right then, that she might very well say no. And because they were so destabilizing, they left her feeling in some way bereft. And I thought at the moment, I know exactly what that is, because joy that has nowhere to go turns inward and consumes the person, and it becomes an actually dangerous thing. And joy has to have somewhere to go. And I think the reason for that is because joy comes from God. And we have these moments when our life is cut into, And if we have nowhere for that to go afterward, joy asks something of us. And Jürgen Moltmann says compassion is the other side of a living joy. It asks something of us afterwards. Happiness doesn't ask anything. And I think that's the reason that Zadie was, quite conflicted about it, was it had nowhere to go. And you can experience, as I was saying earlier, you can experience joy in the midst of great suffering, but you're not going to experience happiness. That's altogether different. Your life is wrecked, and you're suffering, and you're deeply unhappy. But you can have a moment of incredible joy in the midst of that.
You have a pretty palpable impatience with scientific materialism in the book, as you've had in a good bit of your work. What's the source of that impatience for you? Impatience?
What aspect of science? I love reading scientific books, physics in particular. I get impatient when the world is defined that way, when people think that a scientific description of the world has exhausted the world, or that they've explained all metaphysical aspects of an experience by telling us the physical basis of it. And that happens all the time. I just read a book by Adam Kirsch, who's a friend of mine who I admire enormously. But he wrote in a book about transhumanism that religious people pretend like the I is a mystery still, that there is some mystery to who we are, but scientists know what that is, and they've known it for a long time. That the scientific source of ourselves. And I thought when I read that is not true at all. No one knows that. If we knew that, we would know what it means to understand something. We would know what consciousness was. And no one makes that argument, that we know what consciousness is. So I get frustrated when science reaches beyond its realm, or reaches beyond its ability, and tries to become a description of everything. But I have to say, I mean, my imagination has been enormously aided by reading about science.
Yeah. So, put some of that in kind of narrative perspective for us of kind of the scope of your life. So you're raised in a Baptist and or fundamentalist and or Pentecostal home growing up.
It was, Southern Baptist with a charismatic
bent, yeah. And then do you leave that pretty soon after leaving home?
I left it immediately. Yeah, as soon as I read Nietzsche when I got to college, and Nietzsche just seemed to me impossible to argue with. It seemed to me, well, that pretty much blows up that world. And
that's funny. I remember writing a paper about him as well in college. Yeah, And then after you you let that, or you find him convincing and let that blow all that stuff up. What are then kind of phases and how you began to process that over time?
Well, I became a poet, and I didn't really think of Christianity, but I still, the writers I most loved were religious writers: George Herbert, Marilyn Robinson, Simone Weil I came to very early. And so I was still very much attached to literary expressions of religious feeling, so long as they remain literary. And Simone Weil practically is literary, the parts that I responded to. And I sort of floated, my spiritual life was, came through poetry, came through poems. And I was always convinced that there was something other, because the poems taught me that. They kept showing me over and over that I wasn't entirely responsible for what I was writing, and that the poems themselves reached into realms of experience that I didn't understand. They were far beyond what I could understand, and the poems showed me that. And then eventually, I've always been obsessed with the relation between art and life. And when I was young, it seemed to me that they were antithetical. Yeats says that if Maud Gunn had only loved him, I might have thrown poor words away and been content to live. And I always felt that life was the fuel for art. And yeah, part of my maturation was growing to see those things as fused, that you can't separate them really at all. And so the poems, like those moments of joy, were asking something of me. They were asking to be translated into life, to have an expression in life. And I don't understand why more artists don't make that move. I don't understand why they can be so in touch with the numinous in their work, and then it just becomes inert in their life. But that is the case for a lot of people. But for me, the poems ask something. And so I had to make a conscious movement toward faith in my life.
I think the first time I met you and interviewed you was about your memoir, My Bright Abyss. And I think at that point, I assumed that your rediscovery of faith of some sort kind of came more out of the fact that you were somewhat recently had fallen in love and had also been diagnosed with a potentially terminal cancer. Did those factor into this, or was it more your experience of poetry?
Well, the experience of poetry made faith an abiding concern my whole life. It never went away. Meeting Danielle led me to want a form for it. We began to pray before meals, and we almost went to church the day we got engaged. We paused, I write about it in the book, we paused outside the door and thought about going in. I mean, right at the door. And then we both kind of laughed and didn't do it. and then I got the diagnosis, and that did make the need for a form urgent. And yeah, so I went to a church then.
Yeah. As you observe Christianity in America these days, which is obviously a fraught endeavor, what do you see that's frustrating, exasperating? What do you see that gives you some sort of sense of hope?
My students give me a great sense of hope. I mean, they are, a lot of them are very anxious and conflicted in their own religious beliefs, and people who are certain about their religious beliefs would have contempt for them. But they are genuinely trying to do good in the world and genuinely trying to come to terms with the call of God as they have understood it. And I really admire it. They're coming from so many different directions, all different ages. Some of them have had other careers. Some of them are right out of college. But they're embarking on a path that in which the rewards are minuscule, and contempt is everywhere, and yet they're doing it. And so I find their lives very hopeful, and they go into prisons, they go into hospitals, they have all these experience working with people who need it and people who need help. So that is definitely a source of hope. I mean, my sense of hopelessness is like so many people I know. It's the way that Christianity is manipulated in this country, the way it's fused with politics. It's become an obscenity. I mean, you don't need me to say that. I don't have anything new to say about that. It's gross. Yeah.
You quote one of my favorite passages from Thomas Merton. He says, "Many poets are not poets for the same reason that religious men and women are not saints. They never succeed in being themselves. They never get around to being the particular poet or the particular monk they are intended to be by God. They never become the man or the artist who is called for by all the circumstances of their life. They waste their years in vain efforts to be some other poet or some other saint." I guess one of the reasons I resonate with that is I can see myself in that.
How so?
Yeah, I wasn't prepared for you to ask me that question. I think that probably one simple way to put it would be that there's a sort of there's a sort of social form that's expected in the Bible Belt that one, if you're in any way involved in making a living based upon theology or religion in the Bible Belt, it seems that there's always a set of realities that you're having to constantly figure out, when am I ready to push against that and when am I not? So there's this sort of, it's a sort of self-consciousness that you almost feel like you have to be paying attention to, so that you're not a fool that goes blindly, you know. And yet there comes a point, I think, at which you have to begin to say, a sort of, as I've said a lot over the last decade, you get to the point where you have to go on this pursuit of a quest of a healthy, I don't give a damn. Mm-hmm. But that was a long process for me to try to begin to get to that place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say I didn't want to become a religious poet. If you'd said that people might think of me as a religious poet when I was young, and even not so young, I would have vomited. And I still don't like it. I still don't like, I mean, I just want to be a poet. I want to be a poet in the old line of poets, many of whom are quite religious. But that path that I have found myself on was not at all chosen and was completely accidental, and yet is so obviously who I am that I've had to embrace it.
Was there a point at which you came to acceptance about that? Something in particular that precipitated acceptance about that?
Well, I think the book I wrote, you called Every Riven Thing, which was the first book I wrote after my diagnosis. That really changed everything for me. That was my third book of poems, and it just broke everything open formally. It was much more aggressive and in its shifts of forms, and the poems had more velocity and more urgency, and that all came from God. That all came from the poems being both tortured and blessed by this relationship. And so after that happened, I recognized, I didn't come to terms with it exactly, but I certainly recognized, well, this is a change, and this is something different.
What does you talk about the book of Job at some length in this recent book, but when you've are in your times of grief or in your times of suffering, and if feel free to say, let's pass on that question, but when you're in those places, what does your lamentation, what does your imprecation look like?
It's not I never feel angry at God, not like that. I don't think of God as being responsible for my suffering. I guess the only time I feel angry is when God is not there. And really that's why Job is angry, that God is not there. He's angrier for that than anything else. What does it look like? I guess it looks like, there are laments in that book where I do express some of that, although that book was written entirely before my last illness. It was finished before that. I guess it comes out in the work, but unlike anyone, the lament that I feel is being separated from my wife and my kids. It's all very personal. That does make me angry. I often feel like I'm not close enough to God to be angry. Like God is not close enough to me for me to be angry. And that's my great lament as a Christian, really, is that I thoroughly believe in God. I don't ever question that, but I do question whether humans can know God, whether God is ever there for us. And now I've had experiences, these moments of joy when I do think, I've had these glimpses, but it goes away. And it goes away so thoroughly that you almost believe that you've invented it. And that's why I do hold to that notion by Heschel that faith is mostly faithfulness to the times when we had faith. Mm-hmm. That you have to somehow be faithful to the person that you were when you were capable of that experience.
So we get near the end here. You do a little bit of commentary on Harari's new book. What's the title of it? Homo Deus.
Oh, is that his name? What's his name?
Yuval Noah Harari.
Oh, yeah.
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 In which he is, my sense of this vision that seemed to distress you was that it's a sort of vision of life and civilization that transcends all suffering. Mm-hmm. And yet you're making the case that that very hope will rob us simply of what it means to be human.
Well, yeah, I think it's a watered-down version of Thus Spake Zarathustra. I mean, where Nietzsche's his final men. What does he call them? Like the final man, or what? That's not it, but I forget what he calls them. But they nod. He keeps having them nod, and they nod. Where they've eliminated suffering and are experiencing life on this plane of being that is pure happiness. And, Nietzsche rightly has contempt for them. He thinks because all creativity and all life comes out of suffering. I think the notion that you could eliminate suffering is preposterous and make humans into these gods. Even the title of that book is offensive. Homo Deus. I think it's right back in the Garden of Eden, man. I mean, we've been taught this so many times, and the same thing is happening with AI. This notion that humans are becoming godlike, it will not happen, and it will be the same fall over and over again. The lesson has not been learned, and yeah, I found his book useful in the way it articulates a lot that's going on. My students thought it was just a perfect, clear description of the lives that they were living. But I found it crazy in the end.
I wonder if you've got reading Pascal in quarantine.
Mm-hmm.
Would you close that for us, set it up however you want, and then just kind of close with the reading of that?
Yeah, this is from a passage in Pascal, where he's talking about, I don't think I quote him accurately. Pretty sure I don't. The first part is him, I love only those who seek with lamentation, but he's talking about how sorrow can become a kind of eye, and you can use your sorrow as a lens to see your life more clearly. I'm taken by the notion that Paul Ricoeur and others have talked about that we come into a second kind of naivete. Somebody said it before Ricoeur, but I can't remember who it was. But the notion that you have to recover some sort of radical innocence, and it's not the innocence of childhood because it's passed through the fires of adulthood, but it is some renewed vestige of that kind of naivete, where you can think about your relationship with God and experience your relationship with God and with other people and with reality in the way that you once did. Reading Pascal in quarantine. I love only those who seek with lamentation. I love only those whose lives evince some timeless entire. To weep is to see, to be is to bow. I love only those who know a whole new naivete.
Talking to Chris Wiman here in Nashville with us, come down from Yale Divinity School. Chris, it's been a delight to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Great to see you.
Hey there. Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
From PRX.